Ingrid Nixon is a brilliant storyteller, and she has traveled the world. She explores lots of far-flung, remote places with her husband Kevin. They have a eco tourism business, and someday, when my big narrative industries pension fund kicks in, I'm going to go on a trip with her and Kevin, and hopefully with Conchetta, my wife, too. So, but Ingrid has told stories at the National Storytelling Festival as a main stage performer in Jonesboro, Tennessee. She has been at regional festivals, wonderful teacher of storytelling, and I find her to be as witty and bright as she is profound and personable. So please welcome with me Ingrid Nixon.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thanks, Will. Yeah, but everyone, so appreciate you joining us here tonight. What I have for you are two stories. And this first one, along the lines of ghosts and spirits, this time of year, the solstice, believed with pagan times, that it was a time when the veil between worlds was thin. And so in Victorian times, writers picked up on that and they started writing ghost stories for the Christmas time, for the Yule season. And so we all are familiar with Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol, which is a fantastic ghost story. But he was not the only one who wrote ghost stories. And so what I'd like to share with you is a story in the vein of a ghost story for the Yuletide for Christmas. It comes to us from Richard Middleton, who is a British writer, and here it goes. Now, if you travel to England by ship and you come into Portsmouth, and then you travel overland to London, about halfway there, you'll come to the little community of Fairfield. Now, Fairfield, it is a quaint little village. It's got a church, it's got a village green, it's got an inn, it's got a pub called the Fox and Grapes. It is so charming. And the people there in Fairfield will tell you that they would never live anywhere else. Now, if you live in a big city like London, you might think that a place like Fairfield would be a little boring. But for that, I would say you do not know Fairfield, because Fairfield is a place where people just know to let well enough alone. They let things unfold. And so, for example, if you were in London and you heard that perhaps at night the lads who had died in the war rose up to hold tryst with the lassies who lay in the cemetery, well, you might be curious. And you'd go and you'd watch, and the ghosts would feel self-conscious, and so they would move to other places. But in Fairfield, everybody just minds their own business. And so as a result, Fairfield is the ghostliest place in all of England. Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon to be walking through the village green and to see a headless ghost of a man sitting on the edge of a well with two little kids playing at his feet as if he were their father. I mean, ghosts know where they have it good, just like people do. But every now and then, strange things happen, like this story I'm going to tell you about. And strange, I mean, that's saying something. In a community where during the hunting season, there are no fewer than 3 packs of ghostly hounds that go running through the woods. Or a place where the blacksmith has his shop, and then at night he sleeps above his shop, and that allows his great grandfather, who was also a blacksmith, to come and pound horseshoes so he can put the horseshoes on ghostly horses for ghostly gentlemen. And the blacksmith is sleeping right above, and he's not disturbed. He sleeps like a baby. Well, except for this one time when he had a headache. And all that pounding was keeping him awake. So he shouted down to keep it down. And the next morning, on the anvil, there was a very old coin that was left as a kind of apology. But where was I? Okay, strange things. Well, this strange thing occurred in 1897. Now, that was the year of the Royal Jubilee, but it was also the year that in Fairfield, they had two big storms. They called them the Big Blows, and they were about 6 months apart. And the first one happened in the middle of summer. Oh, the wind was blowing. And then finally, when the wind died down, that was when John Simmons went out with everyone else in the village to assess the damage. And that is when John Simmons discovered that the wind had picked up the roof of his pigsty and transported it over the wall into the garden of his neighbor. Now, his neighbor was this old widow woman. And when he went to talk to her, oh, did he ever get an earful? So when she was done, John Simmons decided that the best thing he could do was go down to the Fox and Grapes to get a pint of ale and soothe his ears. So when he was down at the pub, the landlord poured him a pint of ale, and there he sat sipping his ale, telling the landlord all about the roof of the pigsty and about the widow and what she had said and what he was going to do. And when he was done talking, the landlord said, "Huh, well, you think you've got it bad. I woke up this morning to discover there is a ship in my turnip patch." Now, granted, it's a ghost ship. Probably blew up from Portsmouth. Won't do any harm. But still, it's substantial. Well, then the conversation went to the fact that there was a tree that had blown down in the green, and there were some tiles that had blown off the church roof, and that was kind of it. The ghosts of Fairfield had been blown all over England, so they spent the next couple of days walking back to the village, arriving footsore. Some of them were crying. They were just so happy to be home. It took a whole week for the village to get itself back in order. And it was about that time that John Simmons decided that he would go back down to the Fox and Grapes. Well, this time, the landlord was saying, that ghost ship, it's really leaning on the turnips. Here, come and take a look. So the two men went walking down the lane to the turnip patch, and there was a ship. The likes of a ship like this, it had not been seen sailing the seas for the last 300 years. She had 3 tall masts, and the hull was painted all black. She had elaborate carvings, and on the stern there was a great bay window. It looked like a squire's drawing room. There were cannons on deck, cannons facing forward, cannons pointing out the portholes, and at the bow and at the stern there were 2 heavy anchor chains that came down to 2 anchors that were resting on the ground. Well, the landlord looked at the ship and said, "Oh, do you see the way she's leaning on the turnips? Oh, the missus is not going to like this. She's going to want me to move the ship, but I have no idea how." And John Simmons had to agree. I mean, the ship, it must have weighed about 200 tons. You could have used all the horses in Fairfield. There was no way they were going to move that ship. Well, as the 2 men stood there next to the vessel, a man appeared on deck. He came out of the cabin and he moved with an air of command. And he was wearing a smart black uniform that was trimmed with this rusty gold lace. And at his side, he had a long sword that was in a brass scabbard. He spoke like a gentleman. He said, "My name is Captain Bartholomew Roberts. I have put in for recruits. I seem to have brought her rather far up the harbor." And the landlord said, "Up the harbor? You're 50 miles from the sea." And the captain said, "Oh, well, it is of little consequence." To which the landlord said, "Well, good sir, I do not wish to be rude to a visitor to our fair community. However, you should be aware that your ship is in my turnip patch, and the missus is not going to like that. The captain pulled out a gold snuff box, took a little pinch, a little snort, dusted off his fingers, and then he said, I shall not be here for long, and if a testimony of my esteem would pacify your good lady, I should be content. And he loosed a brooch from his throat and tossed it down to the landlord. Now this brooch, it had elaborate silver metalwork, and it had pearls, and it had a few gemstones. And the landlord looked at this brooch and he said, oh, well, I will not deny that the missus does love jewelry, but this is really too much for half a sack of turnips. And the captain said, tut, man, it was a forced sale, and you deserve a good price. Say no more about it. Good day. And he turned and he went back in the ship. Well, as the two men walked back to the Fox and Grapes, it was the landlord who was saying, oh, I cannot help but feel that I came out the better end of this bargain. The missus is going to love this brooch. And she did. And she wore it to church that Sunday and every Sunday thereafter. Well, after a little while, no one was talking about the ghost ship anymore because this was, of course, the summer of the Royal Jubilee. And so they were planning all sorts of ceremonies and celebrations all over England, including Fairfield. Now, the landlord, he did see his nautical tenant from time to time when he went out to tend the turnip patch, but otherwise everybody was busy with preparations. And this was also a time where people didn't really interact that much with the ghosts, except for there was one young fellow in town. He was rather simple. He couldn't tell the difference between a ghost and a real person. I mean, such an innocent. Well, the day of the Jubilee, the church bells were ringing, and somebody had to explain to Captain Roberts what was happening. Well, the captain, being a good Englishman, decided that he would fire off his guns. So he shot off his cannons, only he used live rounds. And so a cannonball went shooting through the wall of one of the farmers' barns. But people didn't get too upset about that. It wasn't until after all the celebrations died down that people noticed that something was afoot in Fairfield. You see, it was John Simmons, and he was at the Fox and Grapes, and he was talking to the shoemaker. And the shoemaker turned to him and said, do you know my great-great-uncle? And John Simmons says, you mean Joshua, the quiet lad? He said, quiet? He's been coming in at 3 o'clock in the morning, drunk as a magistrate, and he's waking up the whole house. And John Simmons says, well, Joshua, he's one of the most respected ghosts in the village. And the shoemaker said, well, if he keeps this up, one of these nights he's going to come home and that door is going to be locked. Well, John Simmons, he was shocked to find someone talking like this about one of his ancestors. And he was even more shocked to discover that someone like Joshua had turned to drink. Well, it turns 2 tables over, there was the butcher. And the butcher was saying, that young puppy, oh, that young puppy. Well, it turns out that he was upset about one of his ancestors. And the shoemaker said to him, is it drink? And the butcher said, yes. And he downed his pint. Well, this was a common story all over Fairfield. All the young men who were ghosts were coming home at all odd hours, just drunk. And the word started to spread to the other villages throughout the region. And then somebody made up a little rhyme, and soon all the kids throughout the region were all singing this little rhyme that went like this. Sodden Fairfield has no use for bread and butter. Rum for breakfast, rum for dinner, rum for tea, and rum for supper. Oh, the people of Fairfield did not like that. And it didn't take long to find out where the rum was coming from. The landlord was very upset to discover that his nautical tenant was causing such a disruption in the community. But it turns out that his wife would not give back the brooch, and so he felt as though he couldn't turn his tenant out. Well, and then as time passed, as August turned into September, turned into October, November, the early December, oh, things just went from bad to worse. Now, it seemed as though the older ghosts, they could give the rum the go-by. But the young men who were ghosts, oh, they found the rum irresistible. So soon you couldn't help but walk through the village green and see 3 of them sleeping it off, whatever time of day. Well, it was the day before solstice. And this was when the parson happened to be passing through the green. And there was a young man ghost lying there just... And it was then the parson said, "That's enough of that." So he went to John Simmons' house, pounded on the door. And when John Simmons answered, the parson said, "I need to go talk to the captain about the drunkenness in this village, and you need to come with me." Well, John Simmons said, "They're ghosts. What's the worst that can happen?" And the parson said, "Dead or alive, I am responsible for their good conduct. Get your coat." So soon the 2 men were walking down that lane on this wintry day, approaching the ghost ship. And it so happens that the captain was out on deck taking the air. And when the captain saw the parson approach, he took off his hat in a bow. And the parson took that as a signal. He said, "Good sir, I need to have a word with you." And the captain said, "Well, come aboard," as if he knew exactly what the discussion was going to be about. So the 2 men climbed up that rickety ladder onto the deck, and then the captain welcomed them into his cabin, the one in the back with the great bay window. And this cabin, oh, it was loaded with gold plates and silver plates, and there were trunks everywhere and artifacts from all over the world. And as the 2 men looked around, the captain pulled down 3 silver cups. And then he said, "May I offer you some rum?" And the parson did not shake his head no very vigorously. So the captain poured 3 glasses of rum. And when John Simmons took a sip of that rum, oh, his opinion of the situation changed entirely. He had never tasted such rum. It was no surprise that the young men who were ghosts could not pass this up. It went through his veins like honey and fire. And then John Simmons turned his face toward the great bay window as the captain was saying, "How may I be of assistance?" And the captain and the parson began to talk, and John was looking out that bay window, admiring the fishes that were swimming by in the water above the turnip patch. It seemed the most natural thing in the world, which just means this was indeed a ghost ship. But he had no idea how long he looked at those fishes. But he was finally called back into the room when the captain said, "It is disturbing to me that I have been a source of discomfort in this community, which has shown me such great graciousness. You gentlemen should be happy to know that I plan to sail tomorrow night. So, will you please toast with me for a safe journey?" And the 3 men stood together on that ghost ship, and they clinked their silver cups, and they drank down that rum. Well, the next day, the winter solstice, that was the 2nd big storm in Fairfield. Oh, the wind was howling. And just as it was getting dusk, that was when John Simmons looked out his window just in time to see the wind pick up the roof of his pigsty and transport it over the wall into the widow's garden. And he thought, oh, I shall not wait to have a conversation with her. I am heading down to the Fox and Grapes. As he made his way down the lane, the wind was so strong it pushed him along. And when he got down to the pub, well, the door was easy enough to open, but to close it, it required all his strength and the strength of the landlord, too. But once he was inside, the landlord poured him a pint, and over that pint they talked about, oh, there was rumor that there was a chimney that was down in the village, and perhaps there was a bridge that was damaged as well. And then suddenly John Simmons said, huh, isn't it interesting how sailors always seem to know the weather? The captain said he would sail tonight. And the landlord said, you know, that's not such a bad thing. And just then the wind, which had been howling outside, stopped. It was silent. And there in the pub, the men heard the sound of voices, men's voices, all singing together. And so they stepped outside into the night just in time to look up in the sky and see the ghost ship sailing off toward the stars. And the ship was ablaze with lights, and they could hear a fiddle, and they could hear voices, God rest ye merry gentlemen. And those voices sang until the ship disappeared. And the landlord said, just like that, he's gone. And it sounds like he's taken half the village with him. Well, the next day, as they assessed the damage, indeed, virtually all of the young men who were ghosts had sailed off on the ghost ship. And so had the simple lad. Apparently, he'd gone away as a stowaway. Now, there were people in Fairfield who were sad at losing their ancestors. And it was especially sad for the lasses. You know, they had lost their lads once before, and now they had lost them again. But time moved on, and people seemed to put that in the past, and maybe that would have been the end of it, but it was about 3 years later that the simple lad came back to town. He just walked into town, and he had tied around his waist a rusty scabbard, and he had tattoos all over his body. He had tattoos all over his face. His face looked a little like a lady's sampler. But he just walked up to the well that was in front of his mother's house, took a drink of water like he had done it every day. And everybody ran to him. Where have you been? What happened? But he just talked a lot of nonsense about talking parrots and walk the plank and keel hauling, which made some of the people wonder that maybe the captain wasn't the gentleman that they thought he was. But, you know, the ghost ship, it hasn't come back. But if it ever did come back to Fairfield, it would be welcome. And until that time, there is a lass who every night she comes to the same spot in the village green, and she looks up into that night sky looking for that ship, hoping, ever hoping she'll see it and that it will bring back her love. And at this moment, John Simmons pointed to the exact spot in the green where that young lass stands every night. You see, I happened to be passing from Portsmouth up to London, and I got there to Fairfield. And the village was so charming. I had a seat there in the village green. And that's when this lovely gentleman ghost came and sat beside me and told me this story. Oh, and John Simmons says that the turnip patch, it did recover, and that somebody is raising turnips there to this day. However, ever since the episode with the ghost ship, the turnips, have taken on a special flavor. It is the taste of rum. So that is a short story called The Ghost Ship, written by Richard Middleton. And I have one more story for you. And for this, I've got a little prop. But a bit about me, I have a Finnish heritage. I know there's somebody in the audience who spent some time in Helsinki. And so on my mother's side of the family, very Finnish. And when I was a little kid and I was looking through a book about Finland, I was reading about the Sami people. And the Sami people live up in the northern part of Finland, Norway, and Sweden. That used to be called Lapland. Now we refer to it as Sami land, that region. And what I was taken by as I looked at this book were the traditional costumes of the Sami people. And they are just fantastic. This is one of their hats. It's called the Hat of the Four Winds. And they have these beautiful tunics and leggings. And I was so taken with that that I said to my mom, Mom, I know we're Finnish, but are we Sami too? And she's like, no, no. And I'm like, are you sure we're not Sami? I so wanted to be part Sami. Well, it turns out with DNA testing that one of my close family relations got back some results that show we do have a little bit of Sami in us, which made me very excited. So when I was on a trip and I was able to dip into northern Finland, I collected the bones of this next story from a Sami culture camp. I'd like for you to imagine that it's about 1900. It is the middle of December, and we are in northern Finland, and the sun has not been visible for some weeks. The old Sami woman stood in front of her wood stove. She had a chunk of wood and she was about to feed that to the fire. And this Sami woman, she was never tall to begin with, but with age, she had become quite bent. So now she was just downright tiny, but yet she was substantial, like a gnarled stump. And she jammed that chunk of wood in the wood stove and closed the stove door. And then she sat down in her chair and picked up her mug of hot tea. Well, not far from her, in another chair, there was the minister who had come for yet another visit. And he too was holding his mug of hot tea. And he said, "Your fire burns bright, and it warms your cabin admirably." And the Sami woman said, "When you live in cold, dark places, you must worship warm gods." Now, this made the minister bristle a little bit, but he was used to this coming from her. She was proving to be a tough nut to crack. So he said to her, "Do you realize that you are the only person in the whole region who still clings to the old beliefs?" And the old woman said, "I am content." So the minister decided to change the subject, and he said, "You know, I've been reading some things scientific, and you know, there is a growing belief that the northern lights are in some way connected to activity from the sun. That just seems so far-fetched to me." And the old woman said, "Oh, but the sun is a very powerful god." And the minister thought, oh, I walked into that. So he decided to change the subject again. And he said, "You know, there are some in the village that think that wolves are around. The reindeer are very restless." And the old woman was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "It could be wolves, or it could be Christmas travelers." And the minister perked up at this and he said, "Christmas travelers? Do you mean Like the three kings of the Orient who made their way to Bethlehem? No. No, the Christmas travelers are spirits. Spirits that walk here in the Northland in these dark times, a time that you call Christmas. Perhaps they are spirits of those that were lost in the wilds, or maybe they have no family. There are some that think that perhaps they are seeking to draw others into their fold. The minister said, "Well, how do you know of these spirits? Have you seen them?" No, no. It is only rare that they can be seen by a human, but reindeers see them, as do dogs and cats, and it makes them restless. And then the minister said, "Well, if you've never seen them, then how do you know they exist?" And the old woman said, "Well, that's an interesting question coming from someone of the likes of you. But do you know Jarvis in the valley over?" "Do you mean the blind man?" "Yes. You know, he was not always blind. When Jarvis was a young boy, one December night, he was with his family in their cabin. And they could hear in the pen next to the cabin that the reindeer, they were stomping their hooves and they were snorting. Something was disturbing them. And so they sent Jarvis out to investigate. Now, there was no sun, but the moon was shining brightly and it reflected on the snow, so it was actually quite bright. And Jarvis, he walked all around that corral that was holding those reindeer, and he saw no tracks of wolves. He heard no howls. But it was then that he saw the procession. It was a procession of sleighs. And the first sleigh, that was pulled by a coal-black steed. And in that sleigh, there were two people. They were very pale. And even though they passed right by the boy, they never looked at him. And the second sleigh, that was pulled by a cow. And in that sleigh, there was one man. He had only one eye. He, too, was very pale. He never looked at the boy. And the third sleigh was pulled by a white reindeer, and so on and so forth. A whole series of sleighs, each one pulled by a different animal, until the final sleigh was pulled by a tiny mouse. And even though this mouse was just so small, it did not strain at all to pull this sleigh and its pale occupants who did not look at the boy. And at the end of the procession, there was a man walking, and this man was wearing skins, reindeer skins, that were very light in color, and they reflected the moon. He just seemed to glow. And Jarvis was so taken by this that he couldn't help but call out, "Good day, sir!" And it was only then that the man turned and looked at the boy, and his eyes got wide, and the look of fear came across his face, as though he had never expected to be seen by a human. And so he began to say, "No, no, 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 mark my words, nothing good will come of this." And it was that night that Jarvis became very ill. He had a high fever that raged for days. But when he recovered and he opened his eyes, that's when they learned that he was sightless. "So that's why I know there are Christmas travelers," said the old woman. The minister stirred uncomfortably and said, "You seem to fear the winter darkness." "Oh, the winter season is nothing to take lightly." And the two sat quietly in their chairs, thinking their own thoughts for a long time, until the fire had burned down and it was time for another piece of wood. So the old woman got up, and as she was getting the wood, that was when the minister said to her, tell me, when the sun, your God, disappears for weeks on end in the winter months, how does that make you feel? Does that make you feel abandoned by your God?" And the old woman was managing this chunk of wood, and she said, no. Before the God disappears, she sends one of her children to my cabin, and it sits right here on the stove and keeps me warm all winter." And the minister looked at the stove as though he were expecting to see a little god sitting right there. But instead, what he saw was the Sami woman, and she was holding that chunk of wood. And so the minister said, So, so you believe in the sun god, and you believe that everything has a spirit, and you believe that trees are gods, but yet you cut down trees and you burn them. And the old Sami woman, she stuffed that chunk of wood in the stove and then closed the stove door. And then she turned and looked at the minister. She pulled herself up to her full height, which wasn't much, but it was enough. And she looked the minister in the eye and said, "Only a god is worthy food for another god." And the two looked at one another for a time, and in their glance, back and forth, there was respect and also a fondness. And then the two began to gently laugh. Thank you. A story from northern Finland for these dark, dark days. Well, I have loved sharing stories with you, but now it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Will Hornyak, who is someone that you all know. But Will is a storyteller who helped me discover what storytelling is. He was someone who I saw performing, and I was so taken by his work that I just said, "I want to do that too." That was many years ago, and since that time, he has been both an example and a great mentor. And he is not only a fantastic storyteller, but a wonderful poet. And he has just come out with a new book of poetry, which I hope, Will, you will have a chance to tell us a little bit more about. But now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Will Hornyak. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ingrid. Ingrid, what beautiful stories. Absolutely gorgeous. I love I can't remember if it was the parsnips of the rum flavor, but I love how you bring us right into the story at the end. And also that Sami woman, she's going to resonate in my imagination for a long time. And I love her line, "The winter season is nothing to take lightly." Well said. Well said. So I wanted to just change the mood a little bit with a song. You can join me with it. You all know it. This time of year, because of the darkness and the winter, it's a time of reflection, and I often get into asking, the profound questions. And one of the profound questions to me is, um, what would have happened if the person who wrote "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" also wrote "Silent Night, Holy Night," you know, but got the melodies mixed up, at the beginning. So it would have sounded like this, I think. Silent night, holy night, all is calm as all is bright, round yon virgin mother and child, and its holy infant, oh so tender and mild. Sleep, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. Help me out. Sleep, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. It doesn't get much worse than that, my friends. We're going to start with a really low bar and we're going to go up from there, okay? Yes, I also do "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" to the tune of "Silent Night, Holy Night," but that's a whole other story. Uh, when I was working as a commercial fisherman many, many years ago up in Ingrid's part of the world, I was on Bristol Bay at a fishing camp on a huge river. And I got there in May, and that's the land of the midnight sun. And because in a fish camp, there's always work to be done, and because the sun is always out, you're just working all the time. And at times the sun would set at midnight and then it would rise again at 2 in the morning. And it wouldn't really set. There would always be a glow of light in the air. And by the end of the summer, I was there for 3 months. I just hungered for the dark and hungered for stars and hungered for all the richness of the night. And because of that, I've always had a strong connection to this particular story, which comes from the Yoruba people in Africa. But of course, they brought it to Brazil when they came there. And they say that in a long ago time, the great goddess Iemanjá, she was the keeper of the dark. She lived at the bottom of the sea. And all the creatures of the night and the things of the night and the spirits of the night and all the darkness she kept there. But Iemanjá had a daughter. And you know how it is. Children want something a little different than their parents. And her daughter wasn't content just to live with all those things of the night and in the dark. And she swam up one day towards the upper world. And she could see now. She could see the blue waters and the emerald green waters. And at last she arrived in the daylight world, in this world upon which we walk. But you see, in those days, there was no night. There was only brilliant sunlight. And she thought it was so beautiful. Everywhere there was radiance. Everything was shining and shimmering and bright. And the smells of the orchid, the perfumes of the jungles and the trees. She fell in love with that place. And in time, the daughter of Iemanjá fell in love with the Lord of Daylight. And he showed her all around, and she knew that she would be with him. And so it was. They were. They were husband and wife. And they lived for a time, for a long time. But one day, the daughter of Iemanjá said, "Husband, I love you, and yet I cannot stay here. I must return home. I need I need the darkness. I need the stillness and the quiet of the night and all the creatures of the night. I hunger for that, husband. I must go home just to stay there even for a little while." And he thought and he said, "No." He said, "I can't live without you. No, 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 no. Allow me to find another way." And so this Lord of Daylight, who loved his wife, the daughter of Iemanjá, so much, he found his three most trusted servants and he sent them on a mission from the land of daylight deep down into the oceans, into the realm of Iemanjá. And they pleaded with her and said, "Your daughter hungers for the spirits of the night and the darkness. Will you help her?" And Iemanjá, the goddess, she went into her storehouse of the night. And in great sacks, she gathered up blankets and folds of darkness. And she gathered up the owls and the bats and the night birds and the panther and the leopard and all the creatures of the night. And then she gave these big bags to the servants and she said, "Now listen to me. Do not open them until you are in the presence of my daughter, for only she will know how to care for them and how to tend to them." And they promised. It was a long journey. And when they came to the daylight world, the animals and the spirits of the night, they could sense the difference there. They could feel the warmth. They could see the light penetrating even through those thick pouches. And they began to stir. And eventually they broke out and went wild. And for a time it was chaos. The birds and the creatures, they all fled. In the folds of night, they were tangled and rumpled and flew across the sky in chaos. But the daughter of Iemanjá, she heard those things. And she came down to the edge of the ocean. She spread out her arms and began to sing and to chant this beautiful, beautiful song. And as the birds heard that, the owls and the bats and all the others, they slowly circled around her until all of them came and perched upon her arms. At last, even the cheetah, the panther, they curled up around her feet. And finally, she reached out, and she took her hands, and she grabbed the edges of the night. She took the great blanket of darkness, and she shook it out. And as she did, the stars flew out, and the moon found its place in the sky. And at long last, the daughter of Iemanjá pulled up the great, dark blanket of night across the earth. And in that way, the people slept the deepest, longest sleep they'd ever slept, and their dreams were rich and good. And the Yorubas say, so it was. In that way came the first night to the upper world. Thanks to the Yoruba people, and thanks to Iemanjah for the things of the night. Well, thank you. One of the reasons that I love this time of year is I do love the night sky. And it's interesting what Ingrid was talking about earlier about the person that was blind. Um, because there's an old saying, you know, as we close the outer eye, the inner eye opens. And sometimes in darkness, we see more clearly. And of course, navigators knew that because when darkness came, they could see the stars and navigate more easily. And among those navigators one time were those three men that saw a brilliant star. And I've always been intrigued by the fact that they traveled by night because they could see the design and they could see the pathway more clearly. So I wrote this little poem in honor of that great story of the three wise men. It goes like so. The three wise men maybe were not considered wise, or even in possession of all of their senses at first. For men who suddenly depart from friends and family, lucrative enterprises, positions of power, and plush thrones, for long camel rides of indeterminate distance and duration over forbidden foreign terrain in the dead of winter, drawn by a distant star, are seldom considered wise. Mad? Foolish? Yes, but wise? Not likely. Yet wisdom is distilled drop by drop, slowly over time, not manufactured overnight. And now, ages hence, we all drink that intoxicating liquor, brewed from a courageous, plodding, humble pilgrimage, made by men bearing gifts in the darkness, to where and for whom they knew not. They knew only to leave all they knew for a long night journey toward a beckoning star. In honor of the great three wise men. Uh, I uh, I wanted to welcome this winter time of year with a couple of sayings that I like. First, by William Blake. I've always loved this. He says, "In seed time, learn; in harvest time, teach; and in winter time, enjoy." You know that it is a season of joy. It is a season to truly savor the bounty and the beauty of life. And another favorite quote is from Richard Pryor, the comedian, and it is this: "When I found out winter was optional, I split." He was raised in Chicago and I think ended up in LA. In the Norse tradition, there's a tradition, of course, of the bears and of hibernation. And I've always been a fan of hibernating, of spending time alone and quiet. Um, they say that in Roma lore, Romas were called gypsy, but we recognize the Roma culture. In Roma lore, there's this idea that a violin could lose its music. The music could just drain out of it after being played so long and in so many places. And what they would do is they would take the old violin and put it into a beautiful case, and they would put beautiful soft wool and fleece all around it and close it up, and then put it into a very dark basement or even into a cave and allow that music to slowly seep back into it. The Celts had an understanding too that the poets and the bards and the singers needed to replenish their word hoard. That was the saying. We must replenish our word hoard. And that is sometimes done in silence and in stillness to allow the language, again, wants to percolate up into us in heart and mind. And the the Greeks even had a cult called the cult of Zalmoxis, where some people would actually go and they would hibernate for 3 months at a time, eating very little and fasting primarily, because they understood the incredible power of darkness in its ability to open the inner eye. The Norse sometimes consider this time of year, the winter, is when the great wolf of the winter swallows up the sun. And there's a number of cultures where we have this swallowing up going on. And there is a fear of being swallowed up, by darkness, whether it's a darkness of the night or being swallowed up by a metaphorical darkness, a darkness of ignorance, a darkness of greed, a darkness of Armageddon. And among the earliest stories of that is one that I love from the Nimi Poo people. The Nimi Poo are known by most as the Nez Perce, the great Nez Perce tribe of the inland Northwest. Their traditional homeland was the Wallowa Mountains and also the Salmon and the Snake and the Clearwater rivers in Idaho. This is a story that was passed on to me from a book called Coyote Was Going There, the Indian Literature of the Oregon Country, by a great writer and ethnographer and English teacher. His name was Gerald Ramsey. They say, the Nez Perce, the Nimi Poo, that in the long ago time, before there were two-legged people on the planet, there were still people. There were the flying people. There was eagle and great blue heron, and there was duck and hummingbird, and all of those. There were the slithering people, rattlesnake. There were four-legged people, deer and bear and elk and such. There were swimming people, salmon, steelhead, eel, and of course there were crawling people. Well, all of those people gathered together because they had to decide how long the day was going to be and how long the night was going to be. And of course, the first one to speak was Grizzly Bear. And Grizzly Bear was the first to speak because he was always the first to speak. You know the type, right? And Grizzly Bear, he said, 6 months day, 6 months no. Well, not everybody really wanted 6 months of day and 6 months of night, but nobody wanted to argue with Grizzly Bear. So everybody just said, well, okay, I guess we could make that work. Compromise is the essence of community. Everybody said stuff like that, except for one tiny little frog. Can you imagine a little frog looking up at a grizzly bear? And Frog did. He just looked up and he said, mm-mm, mm-mm. Frog said, one day, one night, one day, one night, one day, one night, one day, one night, one day. Bear looked down and he said, 6 months day, 6 months night. But Frog said, mm-mm, one day, one night, one day, one night, one day, one night. And Bear said, 6 months day, 6 months, one day, one night, one day, one night. 6 months day, one day, one night, one day, one night. Well, they kept arguing, you see. And Grizzly Bear did the only thing Grizzly Bear knows how to do. He just got louder and louder and louder. 6 months day, 6 months night, 6 months day, 6 months. One day, one night, one day, one night. Well, finally, that huge grizzly bear, he shouted so loud, 6 months day. And he shouted for so long, 6 months. No. Well, he finally, 6 months. He finally lost his voice. And Frog looked up and said, one day, one night. Well, Bear went off into the mountains. And up there he slept and slept and slept about 6 long months. But that little frog just kept speaking up. And so ever since that day, every winter, when it gets cold, Bear still goes to sleep a long, long time. But all the rest of us, we just have one day, one night, one day, one night, one day, one night. Well, as the Nimi Poo say, you don't have to have a big voice to make a big difference, but you do have to speak up. Let's thank them for this story. That's one of those stories that I've told to kindergartners and I've told to workshops for lawyers and all kinds of things. There's something about having the guts to speak up to speak truth to power. We did a celebration for the birthday of William Stafford years ago. And I told that story because William Stafford was a rather small man physically, but he had an incredible voice and he had incredible backbone. And even in World War II, he declared himself a conscientious objector, you know. And of course, as he spoke up, you know, large bear-like voices came around and roared at him again and again and again. But he was persistent and he kept speaking up. And of course, he's gone on to become one of our great poets and moral compasses, I think, too. Well, speaking of the Nez Perce, um, they live in, to me, one of the most beautiful places in the world, up in the Wallowa Mountains of northeastern Oregon. And the story of how they came to be, they say that in that long ago time, before there were the two-legged people, there was a huge, huge monster in that time. And this monster, he was always hungry. He could never get enough. And because of that, they called him Swallowing Monster. And one day, Swallowing Monster was walking up into the Snake River country, and he came down to the Snake River, and he saw that all the swimming people, all the fish had pooled together in one place. And he went down, and as usual, he was hungry. He lifted them all up, and he swallowed down all the fish. So there were no swimming people. But Swallowing Monster, he was still hungry. He went into the woods now, and he took deer and bear and wolf and white-footed mouse, and he ate and he ate and he ate till he'd eaten all the four-legged people. But he was still hungry. And now he took birds from the sky. He took goose and duck and great blue heron, red-winged blackbird, and he ate and he ate and he ate until at last Swallowing Monster had eaten everyone, except for Coyote. Coyote, they say he sort of took that day off. You know, Coyote was downstream. He was doing important things. He was playing in a waterfall. But you know, sometimes as you're playing, you start thinking. And Coyote, he was thinking, you know, the two-legged people will be coming soon, and they will need something to eat. I'll tear down the waterfall, and that way the fish can go upriver more easily. And so Coyote, he did that. He tore the great waterfall down stone by stone by stone by stone. And then he called out, okay, swimming people now. Go upriver, swimming people. Swimming people, go upriver. Swimming people. No swimming people. Coyote, he looked about and found pretty soon there were no flying people, swimming people, four-legged people. There was nobody but himself. And then he saw the big tracks of Swallowing Monster, and he decided to follow them. And now Coyote was walking and walking, but as he was walking, he was thinking. Coyote was always thinking, you know. And as he was walking and thinking, he'd pass by some pieces of flint. And he took the flint, he put that into his pouch, and he kept walking. And as he was walking and thinking, he saw pieces of obsidian. And he took those, and in time he had carved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sharp stone knives. He hung those from his belt, and he kept walking and thinking. And he passed a big fir tree, and he made a ball of pitch from the sap of the tree, and he put that into his pouch, and he kept walking and walking and walking. But one day he looked up and up and up, and there he could see Swallowing Monster. He was pretty big now. He had a foot in Oregon, 1 foot across the Snake River in Idaho. His butt was sort of in Washington. His tail rolled all the way out into Canada. He was big. But you know what Coyote's like. He just walked up to Swallowing Monster and said, hey, you, give back all the people now or I'm going to swallow you. Swallowing Monster looked down. He picked Coyote up by his tail and just swallowed him in one gulp. And Coyote, he fell down, 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 deep in the belly of the Swallowing Monster where it was so dark down there he couldn't see. But he groped about and he found a stick. And then he remembered the pitch. Remember the pitch. He took the pitch, he put it on the stick. And then he remembered the flint. He took the flint. He made sparks and he lit the pitch and made a torch and then He could see everybody else down there with him now. And people said, hey, look, it's Coyote. Hey, he'll know what to do. Coyote, how can all of us here, how can we get out of the belly of this big swallowing monster? And Coyote said, well, I came that way. Maybe we could, you and I, or check out that way. And then, if we did that, we could, and who knows, it could be, if we got that and I don't know. I don't know, Coyote said. But I'm kind of hungry. Is there anything to eat? And the people said, eat? Coyote, you're always thinking of your belly. How can you think of food at a time like this? Coyote, look. Well, he looked, and you could see many people had died inside of the belly of Swallowing Monster. There were bones scattered everywhere. But Coyote said, well, I always think a little better if I have something in my belly. Anything would do, isn't isn't that a piece of fresh liver hanging up there? Well, it was. He took one of his sharp knives and he reached up and he cut some of the liver, and then he cut some of the tripe, and then some of the heart. And after a while, Coyote, he made a little cooking fire with his torch, and soon Coyote was roasting meat for all the people. He was feeding them tripe and liver and heart and liver and tripe, and the people realized they were a little hungry. And after a while, they were all gathered around, and Coyote was feeding them a big feast, and they were talking and thinking and laughing, and everyone feasted. Everyone spoke. Everyone enjoyed themselves. Well, not so much Swallowing Monster. He grabbed his belly, he twisted and writhed, and he fell down. And when he did, Coyote said, now quickly, we don't have much time. Gather the bones of any who have died and run. You take these, go that way. You take these, go this way. You take these, go that way. Go, now go. And the people, they listened to Coyote. They picked up all of the bones. And some people were able to escape through Swallowing Monster's ears. They went that way, that way. Some went through his nose, his long snout. Some opened up his big mouth and got right through the sharp teeth. But some had to go out the back. Muskrat was the last to get out. He was always the last to do anything. And he finally got out toward the back there, and he opened it up, Oh, here's where everybody is. I'm coming too. And Muskrat got out. But when he did, Swallowing Monster's behind closed hard on his tail, and he was stuck. And he had to be pulled out. And in that process, they pulled the fur right off Muskrat's tail, which is one of the ways you know the story is true, for Muskrat still has no fur on its tail. Well, he got out, and when everybody had escaped with all the bones, Coyote said, bring me the bones now. Bring me the bones of all who have died. It was a huge pile, as you can imagine. But Coyote is what was called a rememberer. He remembered everyone, and he remembered everything. And carefully, over time, he carefully pieced back together the bones of all of the flying people. He pieced back the bones of all the four-legged people, the slithering people, the flying people, all of them, just the way they had once been. He only had one knife left, and he took it. And they say when Coyote carved up the body of Swallowing Monster, he sprinkled some of that blood upon those bones. And just like that, flying people, four-legged people, slithering people, everybody came right back to life. And the last thing Coyote did was to take the pieces that were left of Swallowing Monster, and he cast them east and west and north and south. And the Nimipu say wherever it was that the pieces of Swallowing Monster landed, that's later where all of the two-legged people, the human beings, came to live. Which is maybe why there's still a little bit of Swallowing Monster left in all of us. Coyote, he forgot to leave much right where he was there. He left the heart of Swallowing Monster. And he took his last knife and he washed the blood off the blade into the ground. And he said, for this reason, the people who come to live in this place, they will not be very numerous, but no one, trust me, no one will have greater, nobler more generous hearts than they. And so it was that the Nimipu people came to that place to live. And to this day, if you go to the reservation in Kamiai in Idaho, you can see the big hill, the big rocky hill, which is called the Heart of the Beast. Thanks to the Nez Perce for that story of swallowing monster. Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for hanging in there with us for this time and letting us share these stories and helping Ingrid and I bring these stories to vivid life. It always makes such a difference to have people that are generous listeners and enthusiastic listeners, and all of you have been all of that. So thank you so much. And we'll go back to gallery view if anybody wants to hang out for a while. If you have any questions.